Imagine a weapon so powerful that it could turn any Allied tank into scrap from 3 kilometers away. Imagine armor so thick that no enemy gun could touch it. It sounds like an absolute nightmare for the armies of the Allied powers and the indestructible dream of any general. But what if I told you this same weapon became the most shameful and dreadful failure of German engineering? That the crews of these steel monsters feared them more than enemy soldiers, and that their main combat task was not destroying the enemy, but being ready at any moment to blow up their own machine. This is the story of a wonder weapon that killed its own, a giant that died not from enemy shells, but from its own weight. The insane decree behind it, driven not by tactical calculations, but by one man's obsession with gigantic, frightening toys. You'll see how engineers, understanding the absurdity of the project, built a self-destruct button into the vehicle. You'll learn about ghost battalions that couldn't fight because their equipment was perpetually broken. We'll show how the most fearsome tank destroyer in history got stuck in the first puddle it encountered, and how its crews, en masse, blew up their own 75-ton coffins to keep them from the enemy. Why did the Germans pour their last resources into this expensive farce when they could have built simple, deadly machines? And how did a handful of these monsters still manage to inflict one of the most brutal and methodical defeats on an American tank column, only to be helplessly destroyed from the air moments later? This isn't just a story about a tank. It's a history of how blind faith in wonder technology and a rejection of common sense lead to a terrible, inevitable end. Get ready to learn the whole truth about the Jagdtiger, the machine that was supposed to change everything, but instead became a monument to engineering madness.
Imagine a steel giant whose shadow makes hearts clench. 75 tons of cold steel, capable of turning any Allied tank into a heap of metal from a distance where the enemy can't even spot the threat. Frontal armor a quarter-meter thick, impervious to any gun. It sounds like the weapon of dreams, capable of turning the tide of battles single-handedly. That was what the Jagdtiger, hunting tiger, was meant to be. But its story, from the very beginning, was not of triumph, but a drama of fatal compromises. The origins of this colossus lie in the anxious autumn of 1942. For the Third Reich, the Eastern Front was turning into a bloody meat grinder, and Soviet armor proved to be a tougher nut to crack than German strategists had assumed. In this atmosphere of desperation, a demand was born for a wonder weapon whose mere sight could send the enemy fleeing. Adolf Hitler, known for his passion for gigantism in weaponry, made a typical decision for him. Instead of mass-producing proven designs, he demanded the creation of an absolute monster. The task was essentially to create the perfect sniper on tracks. They had to take the most powerful anti-tank gun, the 128mm cannon, mount it on the reliable chassis of the new Königstiger, King Tiger, and shelter the crew behind armor that could not be pierced. What could possibly go wrong? Work began in earnest. Engineers from Henschel and Porsche were brought into the project, which received top priority. But fate had other plans. The crushing defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 forced them to shelve the costly experiments. 2 prototype vehicles sent for testing into the crucible of battle were lost. The super heavyweight tank destroyer project was filed away. It seemed common sense had prevailed. But war has its own relentless logic. By the end of 1943, it was clear Germany wasn't winning. It was losing the initiative. Soviet troops were crushing the Wehrmacht on all fronts, and the Allies had landed in Italy. It was in this moment of despair that the project was resurrected from oblivion. A wooden mock-up of the monstrous self-propelled gun was once again presented to the Führer, and he was delighted. Before him stood exactly what he had dreamed of, an armored Leviathan with a huge fixed superstructure and a gun barrel aimed into the distance. The order was brief: begin serial production. In April 1944, the vehicle received its fearsome name, Jagdtiger. All that remained was to cast this terrifying image in metal. But it was here that engineering thought collided with the unyielding laws of physics, and the dream began to show its first cracks.
The designers created a truly impressive machine. They took the hull of the Königstiger, lengthened it, and crowned this base with a masterpiece of armor-casting art, a massive superstructure. Its front plate, sourced from Navy reserves, had an incredible thickness of 250 millimeters. At that time, there simply was no tank gun in the world that could deal with such an obstacle. Into the embrasure of this steel fortress was mounted the 128-millimeter cannon, with its colossal muzzle energy. Its armor-piercing shell, weighing nearly 30 kilograms, was a guaranteed death sentence for any Sherman, T-34, or Churchill at ranges up to 3 kilometers. It all looked absolutely invulnerable and all-destroying. However, for every such advantage, a terrible price had to be paid. The price, in the literal sense, was weight. All this steel might tipped the scales at a record-breaking 75 tons for a serial armored vehicle. And here, the engineers made a fatal miscalculation that became the project's Achilles heel. They installed a 700-horsepower Maybach engine in this behemoth, the exact same one used in the 45-ton medium Panther. The result was catastrophic. The power-to-weight ratio was a laughable 9.3 horsepower per ton. On paper, the top speed was still listed at 38 kilometers per hour, but in reality, the Jagdtiger struggled to reach 28, and its usual road speed barely hit 20 kilometers per hour. An infantryman could outpace it with a brisk walk. But even that wasn't the most shocking part. The running gear, borrowed from the Königstiger and already working at its limit under 55 tons, was doomed to constant breakdowns under a 75-ton load. The realization of this led the designers to a truly surreal solution that best characterizes the entire project. The standard equipment for each machine included 2 demolition charges. One was placed under the engine, the other under the gun breech. With German punctuality, the engineers had proactively foreseen that their brainchild would be so unreliable that crews would regularly have to destroy it to prevent capture. Another absurdity was the tracks. The combat tracks were too wide for railway flat cars, so narrower transport tracks were needed. Thus, before every rail transport, the crew had to spend several hours re-shoeing their behemoth, often under Allied aerial bombardment. And yet, despite this glaring set of fatal flaws, the production line, driven by the highest order, began its work. Factory shops, shrouded in smoke from frequent air raids, with great difficulty began to give birth to the first serial steel Titans. The front awaited them, but the front was utterly unprepared for them. Production, which began in July 1944, unfolded under conditions that seemed to mock the very idea of creating high-tech wonder weapons. Factory shops, under constant threat of air raids, worked in emergency mode. Shortages of strategic materials, the drain of skilled workers to the front, constant disruptions in the supply of components, all this turned the assembly of each Jagdtiger into a feat.
The machine's design was incredibly complex, requiring precise fitting and high manufacturing standards. But in the growing chaos of the final war months, this was nearly impossible to ensure. The outcome was predictable. Instead of the planned 150 steel monsters, only 81 were assembled by war's end. Moreover, desperation reached such a level that several machines from the last batch didn't even receive their legendary 128mm guns. There simply weren't enough. They were replaced with less powerful 88mm guns, but not even sights could be found for them. So these costly yet useless armored boxes stood idle, becoming a symbol of the collapsing system. These rare, almost precious, and incredibly finicky machines were combined into two special heavy anti-tank battalions, the 512th and the 653rd. On paper, it looked like the creation of an elite breakthrough force. The 512th Battalion was formed practically from scratch, its personnel transferred from other units, and they had to master the new equipment under extreme time and resource constraints. The 653rd Battalion had a fearsome reputation, earned in battles on the Eastern Front and in Italy with the Ferdinand self-propelled guns. However, by the time of re-equipping, it was already badly battered and arrived to retraining, having lost much of its former strength. But receiving these machines and making them combat-ready turned out to be tasks from different realities. The battalions, almost from the moment they got the vehicles, were plunged into an endless cycle of repairs. Problems started with the simplest thing: transportation. Reshoeing the tracks for rail transport ate up hours of precious time. And when the machines finally tried to march under their own power to their destination, they were overtaken by breakdowns of the overloaded running gear, or became easy prey for the Allied air forces dominating the skies. As a result, instead of fearsome mobile units, the battalions turned into stationary repair depots, guarding themselves. The most telling failure happened in December 1944. German command, launching the large-scale Ardennes offensive, planned to use the Jagdtigers of the 653rd Battalion as a battering rod. But when D-Day arrived, only 3 machines were combat-ready for the start of the operation. The rest were either stuck at railway stations changing tracks or had already broken down for technical reasons in the rear. Grandiose plans shattered against the harsh reality of chronic reliability and immobility of their own weapon. Meanwhile, the front was rolling eastward, unrelentingly tightening the noose around Germany. In March 1945, American troops made a strategic breakthrough, capturing an intact bridge over the Rhine River at Remagen. The established bridgehead was a knife aimed straight at the heart of the Reich. The situation became desperate, and any reserves that could somehow delay the enemy were thrown into battle. Among these forces were those very 6 Jagdtigers of the 1st Company, 512th Battalion, which had managed, by a miracle, to reach the front lines in relatively working order. Their first true baptism of fire awaited them near the Remagen Bridge. There, on the dominant heights, these steel giants were finally to show what they were created for. And, to the horror of their opponents, they did so. The situation on the Western Front in March 1945 was critical for Germany. The American capture of the bridge at Remagen and the establishment of a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine opened a direct road deep into the country. German command, in a panic, pulled all available reserves to this sector, trying to throw the enemy back into the river. Among these forces were the 6 Jagdtigers of the 1st Company, 512th Battalion. These machines, having miraculously preserved mobility and combat capability after all the transport ordeals, were put on alert and directed to the breakthrough point. And here, finally, all the stars aligned for the steel giant. The tank destroyers took up perfect positions for themselves, pre-prepared and camouflaged firing points on commanding heights with an open field of fire. When an American tank column, mostly Shermans, confident in their superiority, appeared below, the Jagdtigers put into action the very concept they were created for. From a distance of 2.5 kilometers, beyond the reach of effective return fire from most Allied tanks, the first shots of the 128mm guns rang out. The powerful armor-piercing shells, each weighing nearly 30 kilograms, pierced the American tanks with such ease as if they were made of tin. The American crews were stunned. They couldn't even see the enemy, and their own shells either fell short or simply bounced off the impenetrable frontal plates of the German self-propelled guns. In short time, the column was destroyed. The Americans lost 11 tanks and up to 50 other vehicles. For the Germans, this was an absolute triumph, proof that their engineering thought, albeit belated, could still produce something terrifying in its effectiveness. But this triumph lasted exactly until a familiar roar appeared in the sky. A patrolling P-51 Mustang fighter bomber noticed the smoke and mouth flashes. Not engaging in a futile duel with the armor, the pilot fired an aircraft rocket at one of the tank destroyers. In an instant, the fearsome hunting tiger turned into a blazing bonfire. Its legendary 250 millimeters of frontal armor couldn't protect it from the threat above. This episode became symbolic of the entire further fate of the Jagdtigers. They could be kings on a perfectly prepared chessboard, but by 1945, the war itself was a different game, where the rules were dictated by those who owned the sky. And as one crew abandoned their burning giant, the other machines of the battalion were already facing far more mundane, but no less lethal problems. The combat debut at Remagen became not the start of a victorious path, but a bright flash against the backdrop of a growing tragedy. For most Jagdtigers, the real and most dangerous enemy was not enemy tanks, but their own design and the complete air supremacy of the Allies. The loss statistics for the 653rd Battalion paint a bleak picture. By March 1945, only a handful of machines were truly combat-ready, while dozens were either under repair or awaiting spare parts. During the retreat under American pressure, the situation became catastrophic. Covering the withdrawal, the battalion lost self-propelled guns one after another. A significant portion was destroyed by Mustang fighter bombers, but characteristically, even more than from enemy fire, the equipment was lost to breakdowns. 2 machines simply stopped in the middle of the road with destroyed, overloaded running gear, not from hits, but from their own weight. It was then that the engineer's darkest invention came in handy, the standard demolition charges. Towing a 75-ton behemoth during a retreat was impossible. Specialized recovery vehicles didn't exist, and assembling a train of ordinary ones would have taken hours under continuous air attacks. And so, crews had to approach their immobilized monsters, place the charges in the design-specified locations, and with their own hands turn the pride of German tank building into a heap of twisted metal. It was a tragic farce. Machines created to destroy the enemy were being destroyed en masse by their own men due to the impossibility of evacuation. The most illustrative episode occurred in the town of Schwetzingen. 3 Jagdtigers attempted to counterattack the already American-occupied settlement. One of them, moving into a field, got hopelessly stuck in the mud. Its power-to-weight ratio simply wasn't enough to get out. The crew was forced to blow it up with a Panzerfaust. The second, which burst into the streets, found itself entrapped. Without a turret, it couldn't quickly turn its gun to threatening flanks. American tanks, attacking from the side at close range, shot it up, penetrating the relatively thin side armor. Only the third machine managed to retreat. By April 1945, of the once relatively formidable force of the 653rd Battalion, only a shadow remained. More than half of the machines were lost, with the majority not in honest combat, but due to breakdowns, lack of fuel, or those very demolitions. However, on another theater of war, in the hills of Austria, the Jagdtigers of the 512th Battalion still demonstrated that under ideal circumstances they could be a weapon of terrifying effectiveness. But that required very special conditions.
On the Austrian front, as part of the 6th SS Panzer Army, the remaining Jagdtigers of the 512th Battalion showed what they were truly capable of. Here, among wooded hills and on prepared defensive lines, they implemented the only effective tactic for them, becoming the perfect weapon of static defense. Taking up a camouflaged position on a commanding height or at a key road junction, such a Jagdtiger turned into an almost invulnerable firing point with colossal range. One of the most striking episodes occurred in December 1944, when one self-propelled gun, covering a road, destroyed 19 American Shermans in 3 hours of methodical fire without suffering a single penetrating hit. This was the triumph of the concept. The most powerful gun and impenetrable frontal armor worked in perfect symbiosis when the enemy was forced to attack head-on into a pre-sighted sector. However, this success was only possible in sterile, almost laboratory conditions. The key word here was position. Any attempt to change it, to maneuver, retreat, or support an offensive, instantly turned into disaster. Fundamental flaws came to the fore. The lack of a rotating turret forced them to turn the entire 75-ton behemoth to shift fire, which in dynamic combat was tantamount to death. Low mobility made it an easy target for artillery and aircraft, and the 80mm side armor, quite acceptable for other heavy vehicles, was an Achilles heel for such a colossus, penetrable by many anti-tank means by the end of the war. The renowned German tank ace Otto Carius, who fought in a Jagdtiger at the end of the war, later noted that one of the main problems was the low training of crews, who lacked time to master such a complex and specific machine. But even he admitted it wasn't just about the men. No amount of experience could prevent the overloaded running gear from breaking, or the weak engine from hauling the unbearable mass any faster. In the last days of the war, the remaining Jagdtigers in Austria made a desperate attempt to break through to American lines, preferring to surrender to the Western Allies. Even in this chaotic retreat, their gun inflicted losses on the pursuing Soviet troops. 2 machines broke through. The third, damaged, was captured and later became a museum exhibit in Kubinka, a silent monument to engineering might and tactical helplessness. So what was the ultimate result of this race to create the perfect steel titan? The results of this grandiose but doomed technical experiment draw a line under one of the most controversial chapters in armored vehicle history. The numbers speak for themselves and leave no room for illusions. Of the 81 Jagdtigers built, only about 30% were lost in direct combat, destroyed by enemy artillery, tanks, or aircraft.
The overwhelming majority, a staggering 70%, met a far more mundane and bitter fate. They were abandoned by the roadside due to fatal breakdowns of the overloaded running gear, left in the rear due to a complete lack of fuel, or destroyed by the hands of their own crews using those very prudently built-in demolition charges. Thus, the most powerful and heaviest tank destroyer of its time fell not to an external enemy. It became a victim of internal contradictions embedded in its very concept, strangled by monstrous weight, a disproportionately weak power plant, and running gear operating at and beyond its limit. The story of the hunting tiger is not just a tale of another tank. It is a clear and instructive lesson in how gigantomania, an obsession with impressive but unrealistic tactical and technical characteristics, can defeat sound engineering sense and strategic expedience. The resources spent on creating one such steel giant were colossal. The same amount of metal, man-hours of skilled labor, engines, and complex components would have sufficed for the serial production of 4 or more light tank destroyers like the Hetzer. These machines were cheap, reliable, had excellent mobility and low visibility, and their defensive effectiveness was incomparably higher. But within a totalitarian system, rational military economic calculation lost to propaganda myth and personal preference. Adolf Hitler was fascinated by big, awe-inspiring numbers: 75 tons, a quarter meter of armor, 128mm caliber. These numbers were supposed to instill terror in the enemy and hope in his own people, creating the image of an invincible Wunderwaffe capable of single-handedly turning the tide of a campaign. In reality, the 81 steel colossi had no discernible impact on the strategic situation. They appeared catastrophically late, when the war's outcome was already decided. There were too few of them to form any significant striking force, and most importantly, they were blatantly unreliable, spending most of their short existence not in a firing position, but awaiting repair or towing. The elite battalions, conceived as a fearsome armored fist, in practice turned into stationary repair workshops forced to guard themselves. The final chord of this story is not the thunder of battle, but the quiet explosions in empty fields and forests of Germany, when crews approached their immobile monsters for the last time. A weapon capable of hitting a target at 3 kilometers and armor impenetrable from the front proved useless against a track broken on the march, an engine seized from overheating, or a rocket diving from the utterly undefended sky. The Jagdtiger will forever remain in history as a monument to brilliant engineering thought perverted by the demands of political propaganda and strategic impotence. It serves as an eternal reminder that in war, that most complex of human endeavors, victory is determined not by size or by impressive individual parameters, but overall effectiveness, reliability, and technological and tactical balance. It is a heap of metal that never became a weapon of victory, but became a harsh lesson for future generations of designers and strategists. And what do you think about such a paradoxical fate for a Wunderwaffe weapon? What other historical examples come to mind where gigantism and reliance on single powerful units were defeated by numbers, simplicity, and common sense? Share your thoughts and ideas in the comments. We're very interested in your opinion.